Welcome to the World War I History Podcast, produced by the MacArthur Memorial. We invite you to follow us on Twitter at MacArthur1880 or find the General Douglas MacArthur Memorial on Facebook. This podcast was sponsored by the Ernst and Gertrude Tico Charitable Foundation. Africa is sometimes referred to as a sideshow of World War I, but that label is misleading. While it is true that the armies that fought there numbered at most in the tens of thousands, small compared to the vast armies in Europe, as historian Byron Farwell wrote, interest in a war should not be gauged by the size of the butcher's bill. As with modern Europe, it is impossible to understand modern Africa without understanding its experience of World War I. And today we're going to explore the Cameroon Campaign of 1914 to 1916, a campaign fought in West Africa over the course of 18 months that saw not only engagements on land, but amphibious operations. And we are joined by Adeboye Tinubu, a PhD candidate at the University of Calgary and a specialist in the Cameroon Campaign and the Nigerian troops that fought in the campaign. Welcome, sir, and thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So when we talk about West Africa, what area are we talking about? And what does West Africa look like politically on the eve of World War I?
When we talk about West Africa on the eve of the First World War, I think it is important to put some things into perspective. And one of them would be that with the exception of countries like Ethiopia and Liberia, majority of countries in Africa at this point were under one form of colonialism or the other. And that was the case in West Africa too, where countries like Nigeria, Gold Coast, now modern Ghana, and the Gambia were all colonies of Britain. And what we now know as Togo and Cameroon were German colonies, and also German Southwest Africa, modern Namibia. And also the French had colonies in West Africa. So 3 of the active participants in the First World War had colonies in West Africa. So the rivalry over territory was already coming up at this time. And we can trace this back to the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885, where African countries were arbitrarily partitioned. And with German Cameroon next to British Nigeria and French Equatorial Africa, the recipe for disaster was already in place. So politically, it was a fairly heated region with the colonial power still trying to navigate how to manage the territory. And a critical example of how tense the period was would be the First Moroccan crisis of 1905, when Germany decided to recognize Morocco as an independent state. This move by Germany was meant to undermine the relationship between France and Britain at this point. So to solve the problem, France had to cede some of its territories in West Africa to Germany. And for colonial power at this time, this was a shameful thing to do. So the idea for France was we were going to rectify this shame, we were going to fix this problem in West Africa. So at this point, the area we now know as West Africa was a ticking time bomb. The boundaries separating the colonies were in the real sense not concrete borders. In fact, because the partitioning of the continent had been done in ways that could be considered irrational, perhaps even bizarre today, some ethnic groups often find themselves under 2 different colonial administrations. So all of this were a recipe for disaster at the eve of the First World War. So when the war came, the colonial powers, and in this case, France, Britain, and Germany, knew that something had to happen in West Africa.
So you said it's a very volatile region right up on the eve of World War I. How would you describe the military assets in this region at that time, and how prepared are they for a war?
It is true that the colonial powers had military set up in their West African territories before the First World War, but they were not created for what they were eventually used for during the war. And then the question would be, what were they created for? Set up was for this military, these soldiers, to help quell internal insurrection, police the citizens, and there are a lot of cases like that in Nigeria, where the soldiers were mainly instruments of the colonial government to preserve and protect colonial institutions and sometimes to guide properties of the colonial masters. It wouldn't be wrong to conclude that there was no contemplations to use these soldiers to fight against European colonial powers. In fact, part of the debate in London was to avoid war in Africa, in West Africa, totally because of the lack of readiness to move troops from Europe to fight in Africa. So there were some people among the European administrators thinking if there was to be a war in Africa, there would be the need to bring in European soldiers to fight on the continent. And again, another reason would be the racial politics of the time and the way these people perceive Africans. Oh, these people are warlike people, so you don't want to bring a war close to a warlike people. And in a sense, a war among civilized people. So you do not want to fight, you do not want to bring a war among enlightened people of Europe to Africa where they are warlike and they fight like savages, like animals. So the only difference here would be France. And France was already building a black force during this period. And in fact, in a different thing, some hundreds of Senegalese soldiers ended up fighting in Europe. And that is to show the difference between the colonial powers and how they assemble their troops. And the other question would be whether they were prepared for war. I'm not sure how to answer this. I would just say, well, I do not think so. Because one, like I've mentioned before, the soldiers were not ready. And a clear example of this would be the case of Nigeria, where until 1914, the northern protectorate and the southern parts had different military setup. They only joined together at the beginning of 1914, just some months before this war. And the lack of readiness will show when the war started. You notice that these soldiers had no prior understanding of fighting against soldiers of other European powers. And majority of them have never fought in this kind of war before. And it shows. Imagine as a soldier and your first engagement as a member of a united Nigeria troop was to fight the soldiers or the troops of another country, another colonial power, away from your territory in Cameroon. Imagine that.
So World War I begins in early August 1914, and the fighting in West Africa begins in the same month. The French quickly take part of the northeastern part of Cameroon, a relatively uninhabited territory that they had been forced to cede to Germany several years before. But what do the British do?
At first, the plan of the British was to defend their colonies close to that of the Germans. And this was obvious with the Nigerian first plan, for instance, where the idea was to defend Nigeria. Do not move out of the colony. Just make sure that the Germans do not invade Nigeria. But later, this changed, and there are two reasons why this plan suddenly changed. One was that France into German Cameroon. You remember I said there was the idea of what happened in Morocco in 1905. We will settle it in West Africa in 1914. And also, there was the assessment of the German capability, the German military capability now to attack Nigeria. And the chances were very, very low. So, Britain decided, the colonial administrators in Nigeria decided to should move in because you do not want to allow France to take over that colony. And the question would be, why? So the colonial politics of this era was that France and Britain, they had been fighting over colonies, over sharing African colonies. So if you allow France to get the whole of German Cameroon, that would be a plus to them. And so in no time, the British quickly decided to move into German Cameroon too. Immediately, Nigerian soldiers mobilizing from the northeast, from places like Maiduguri, from Cross River area into Cameroon. And in no time, you see, through some Yola, through some Maiduguri, moved into Calabar, moved into areas like Mora, Garua, and Gondere in northern Cameroon, just to have a presence here at this point. When the British found out that the French were moving in, they immediately moved in too.
So the British will fail in their initial efforts to occupy and invade Cameroon. Is it due to Again, the fact that these troops have been put together in these units for the first time? Is it due to tactics, training, leadership? What causes the British to fail?
The question of the early days of the war is always interesting and at the same time complicated. Why did they fail in their initial effort to invade Cameroon? It will be a combination of everything you mentioned, and it will be difficult to pick one as this was the reason why they failed. So let us start with the training and composition of the troops. The Nigerian troops in this case, they were only joined as one single entity in January of 1914, and the war started in August. So there you are the first problem. Secondly, they have never faced an opposing force with the training and leadership of the German, and they've been fighting punitive wars in Nigeria against farmers or against sort of local troublemakers, but not outside the country. And so if you combine the fact that they have not been in this kind of mission before, and that they have not even trained for this kind of thing before, the fact that they were just joined some few months ago, that is the problem. So another one would be the leadership of someone like Colonel Percy McClure, who commanded the troops in the attack on Garoua. The decision making was just off. And during my defense, one of my examiners mentioned to me that it was the problem was not only in Africa of this lack of good leadership, but during the early days of the war, even in Europe, there was also the problem of what do we do? How do we do this? So, for instance, in the case of McClure now, clearest evidence decision to attack the German at night in their fort. For one, this was an unknown territory, and secondly, there was no investigation carried out prior to that time of the attack to decide to learn about the position of the German, the level of artillery that they have, and how to maneuver your way out in case of trouble. So it only relied on assumptions. And I think that a crucial lesson in warfare is never to base your attack on assumptions, but on clear evidence. There was even a point he refused to accept the opinion of some of his officers. This deficient leadership gave the Germans the superior hand in the contest and ultimately led to the death of the commander himself. And this led to a leadership shake-up, sort of, with Colonel Carter, the commander of the Nigerian regiment, recalled to London. And there was the introduction of Canadian Brigadier Charles de Bell to now lead the mission. So you had a new commander coming in to change the game totally. And I think that was when the idea of an amphibious operation became a thing.
So given the topography and geographic location of Cameroon, the climate varies from rainy to hot and arid. Did this have an impact on the fighting, and how did the different armies move around through this terrain, and how did they get supplies?
This is one of the aspects that made the war in Cameroon complicated and at the same time fascinating, because all known climates in Africa were present in the colony in Cameroon. So there is no doubt that the climate was significant to the trajectory of the war. For instance, the isolated hills of northern Cameroon served as defensive position for the German troops, and fighting reduced due to the heavy rains in October and November. So if you look at the topography of the country, it's divided into north, central, southern, and the western parts, and that's mountains, desert, rainforest, savanna grassland, and coastal areas. So the implication is that it has 4 seasons, just like maybe North America. So there's light rain from between May and June. And there's a very short dry season between July and October. There's heavy rain between October and November, and then there's a long dry season between October and May. So you have all of these conditions, and so you have to adjust your fighting. You have to adjust how you get logistics to these weather conditions. The heavy rain sometimes destroy the bridge and limit the mobility of the soldiers. And at this point, because of the absence of many tarred roads in Cameroon, the soldiers had to trek, and they trek long distance. Most times they were trekking barefooted, so they were not wearing shoes. They were. I'm not sure how to put this, but because of the racial culture of that time, some colonial officials believed that African soldiers walk better when they don't have shoes. So, this was the situation then. And due to this trekking for long distance without shoes in the forest, many of the soldiers fell ill. If you think, oh, the soldiers were the only ones in trouble here, you think about the carriers. Question of supplies now has been an area where not much have been done, but the role of carrier in getting supplies to the troops cannot be underestimated. Although there were Nigerian carriers in Cameroon, majority of the carriers used by Nigerians, by the British soldiers, by the Allied troops this time were from Cameroon. And they were in thousands. The saddest point about this is majority of them died. The more the troops moved further away from the area close to the port where most of the supplies were, the harder it became for the supplies to reach them. So there were situations of carriers drowning or some of them just escaping. So some falling into the river, some others deserting, some just dying during treks, others from disease and all of that. So the major brunt of the war, the carriers were those ones who bore the major brunt of the war.
And so they're carrying all of the supplies, they're carrying the food, they're carrying, weapons extra.
Yeah.
And you said that the death toll among them was incredibly high during the campaign.
But because unlike the soldiers they were accounted for a little bit, the carriers were not accounted for at all.
Okay.
So there's no sensible estimate of the number of dead ones, but there is a work by David Killingray where he mentioned thousands of them died, and I don't have any reason to doubt that.
Do we know how the Nigerian troops felt about the war?
I think it is hard to answer this question because the Nigerian troops who fought in the war did not leave behind diaries or write autobiographies to explain their feelings about the war. But from the letters, petitions they wrote to the colonial government, it's possible to glean their feelings. One important thing to point out here that has often been left out of the discussion when it comes to African soldiers and their participation in the First World War is the level of their professionalism. So there have always been the argument of, oh, these were not professional soldiers and they were just a bunch of random people selected on the streets, maybe just to fight. And I seek to correct that assumption. These were people, individuals who considered the military as an institution to further your career. There was no difference, little difference between soldiers fighting in Europe and the African soldiers who fought in the First World War. The majority of them joined the military for the same reason soldiers in Europe will be in the military, for the prestige that the military offered, for financial gain, and probably for job security too. So they were not just random people. Having said that, there were lots of letters from these soldiers who fought in this war, requesting for their medals and then talking about the payment of gratuity, something like that. So, in this sense, what I think is they were proud of fighting because of the prestige that comes with fighting and the idea of projecting their masculinity. And I had this discussion with my supervisor about what were they told before going for war. Were they just put to war? I found out it's the same case in the Second World War, the role of propaganda. And it's not just one way. There's British propaganda, there's the German propaganda too. And so this propaganda was very crucial to Nigerian soldiers fighting in Cameroon. First, the idea of living under a German administration was considered scary. Nobody wanted so, and the evidence is right there. The genocide of the Nama and the Herero people in 1903 and 1904 by the German. So the British capitalized on this to tell them, if you don't do this with us, if you don't fight with us as a team, this is likely going to be your future. So for the Nigerian troops, for a lot of Nigerian troops who fought in this war, it was like helping the British to fight off evil off the surface of the earth. So, and that was their feeling even after the war.
So we've talked about the French, the British, the Germans. Are there other European powers involved in the campaign?
This is another interesting question. The Belgians were also involved in the war, and for a very funny reason. Although Belgian Congo is looking to be neutral in the war, A German attack on their eastern frontier at the end of August changed their position, and they joined on the side of the French. There were about 150 soldiers from Belgian Congo in the war who fought alongside the French in the occupation of German Cameroon.
Now, when I think about amphibious operations in World War I think about Gallipoli, and that's not successful. There is a successful amphibious operation in Cameroon in 1914, though. How do the British and French use naval power to gain a foothold in Cameroon?
For obvious reasons, Gallipoli remains the most important amphibious operation during the First World War. One, because of the size, the impact it had on politics in Europe at this point. So when I found out there was a successful one in West Africa, I was surprised, and then I wanted to find out more, because if Gallipoli, the very big one, was unsuccessful, how come we don't get to hear about the one that was successful? So what I found there is that because the British were obviously better than the Germans when it comes to naval power, so they used that to the fullest during the amphibious operation in Cameroon. So the decision to take over Douala was for important reasons. One, there was a fear of Germans using the harbor to land troops and conduct attacks into Nigeria. So taking over the harbor was a very important point to prove. If we don't want the Germans to be able to attack Nigeria, the first thing to do is to make sure that the harbor belongs to, we take over the harbor. So because the Germans could not defend the harbor because they didn't have enough soldiers, and at this point they were thinking, instead of having to fight in areas where you don't have power, where you completely outmaneuvered by the British, we should fight somewhere else. So they decided to move all their troops from the southern part to the north, where they can concentrate their troops. And then because they had no effective navy in German Cameroon at this point, so defending Douala, not the most important thing. This gave the British a free ride into Douala. And not to say that they didn't do enough, because they had to clear mines, all of these things that have been planted by the Germans before they evacuated the place. And at the same time, they had to clear the surrounding towns of German soldiers. So by the end of September of 1914, the Germans have been ousted completely from Douala and the surrounding town. So the implication of this was that the British and the Allies now, because the French were also involved, now had a foothold, a solid foothold in German Cameroon. So that gave them the opportunity to push the Germans to move interland. So there were concerns in Britain, especially. We cannot continue to use imperial money coming from the state purse, to pursue a war in faraway Africa. So you have to find a way to end this war as soon as possible. And that was, at this point, what Douala provided was the starting point to quickly end the war.
At Douala, it is a very small allied fleet, and they're landing Nigerian Marines, or a combination of troops from different colonial areas. What is the makeup of the troops actually landing in that operation?
Yeah, it was a combination of French troops, from majority of them from Senegal.
Okay.
And other troops from other British colonies like Gold Coast, modern day Ghana, from the Gambia, from Sierra Leone, about 100 of them from Sierra Leone, and the majority of them from Nigeria. So all the garrisons from Nigeria, these troops were taken from all the garrisons from Nigeria and sent on this large British ships to Douala. Majority of the small boats that were used were commandeered by Nigerians, French troops, soldiers from different British colonies at this point. So it wasn't only just Nigerian soldiers that were landed at Douala.
So a true kind of coalition.
Yeah.
Okay, and I called them Marines, but are they Marines, or are they soldiers?
Well, there were about 100 Marines in them.
Okay, yeah. So a little mix of that too. Okay.
Yeah.
So after being pushed out of Douala, the Germans retreat into the interior of Cameroon. And you've mentioned that, but walk us through the rest of the campaign to its conclusion.
So the momentum was with the Allies now, with the British and the French at this point. So the plan then changed it, just suffocating the Germans in their enclaves in northern and southern Cameroon. So one of the things the British did after taking over Douala was to block all the access to logistics, to supplies from German. So the French and the British went in different directions to encircle the German. At this point, with the loss of German Togoland, the Germans were no longer thinking of, oh, maybe we could defend this place. The idea was, we cannot defend this place anymore. So the idea of defending Cameroon suddenly became, we should escape. And so the plan, oh, we should just leave this. And this was the basis for their march towards southern march towards Spanish Muni. So at this point, the Spanish colony of Muni Spain was not involved in this. So if we go to Spanish Muni, that would be a safe haven for us until the war ends, because right now we have lost the war. There were reports that the political officials left Cameroon even before the military. And by March of 1916, more than 20,000 or 30,000 German Cameroon troops and civilians have crossed into the neutral Spanish colony of Muni. So that just ended the war.
Do we know what the total casualties are for the campaign?
This is very difficult to answer. One, because of the level of record keeping, that the level of record keeping at this point was totally unreasonable. One of the problems I ran to while doing my research. So the craziest thing I found is the lack of crucial documents to back up various claims. So what I did was to start doing mathematics when I was writing it. So how many people died here? And if you add that to how many people died here, and you just get to very close calculation of maybe. So what I found out that among Nigerian troops, there were about 600 that died from wounds, from diseases, from their injuries. So I'm just going to round it off to 500, 600. Among the Germans, I'm not sure. But the thing is, among the French soldiers, among the French colonial soldiers, the number will be greater than that because they provided the bulk of the troops. So guessing that among the French soldiers to be 1,000. Now, for the carriers, that is difficult to say. And I, like Killingree mentioned, I won't be surprised if number of 10,000s of them. I mean, just it's unbelievable the number of carriers that had died during this one. So getting the total casualties is difficult, but by estimate, it can just say 500 Nigerian soldiers died during this war.
What happens to Cameroon after the German surrender?
I think it is safe to assume that the question of the aftermath of the war was on the mind of British administrators during this period. But then there was another big opportunity that came up. And the question changed to Cameroon or the whole of East Africa. Do we just take Cameroon alone, or do we share Cameroon with France, or decide that France take bigger chunk of Cameroon and then we take the whole of East Africa? Because the war in East Africa was still raging at this point. And resource-wise, it's only logical to go for East Africa. It's larger, has many resources, and then there's Tanganyika there. That is very, very important to maritime trade. So the British decided, what we're going to do is we allow France to take a bigger chunk here, hoping that they will not follow us to East Africa. So the decision fell to the hands of British officials. And an interesting personality here was Francois Georges Picot, a Frenchman. So he was nominated by the French government to be the one to decide, alongside the British, what the fate of Cameroon would be. And this was in 1916. So, and Picot incidentally played the same role in deciding the fate of these countries in the Middle East, between how do we decide? So, to take the attention of France away from East Africa, the British decided to give him a free hand in deciding the fate of Cameroon. So he took a pencil, or maybe a blue pen, and divided the colony into two.
So the bigger one for France and the smaller one for Britain. So, and that'll go back to the point I mentioned earlier about the rational way Africa was divided. So, just in an office, it has divided communities between two colonial powers. So this became like a territory between France and Britain. And after the end of the war, the League of Nations turned Cameroon into a mandate territory. That is, mandate territory are expected to be managed by countries on behalf of the United Nations. But in reality, majority of them oftentimes fall into the hands of the countries managing them. So in no time, the German colony as we know it, Cameroon as we know it, suddenly became a bigger part of French colonial territory, and the other smaller part of Nigeria. So that was the fate of Cameroon after the end of the war.
I had wondered why the British got such a tiny little sliver, when you look at the maps, but I guess it makes sense if they're trying to desperately to keep the French out of East Africa. And they say the Scramble for Africa Part 2 is in right after World War I.
Yeah.
Or right during World War I.
That was the end of the Scramble for Africa. And the affair that started in 1884 ended maybe in 1919. And that was the end of it, because what we had during this period was a sort of rewriting or redrawing of African maps. And then you see that in East Africa, same thing. And the implication is communities, societies, like I mentioned earlier, the partition itself was done in a very, not sure what is the right word now, just bizarre. Bizarre, man. Yeah, just, and you look at it now, it's so interesting. You look at different societies in West Africa, you'll find out they speak the same language in any country, and you go to another country and find out they speak the same language, and you wonder how, and you find out, oh, this was the mistake of 1884. 18, this was 1884, 1885. Oh, this is the. So yeah, you still see the ripple effect of those decisions today in some part of Africa.
How would you describe the legacy of World War I on modern Nigeria and Cameroon?
I think the legacy of the war in Nigeria and Cameroon is so obvious to see today. You just need to look at the makeup of both countries. For instance, in Cameroon, you look at the division of the country into an English-speaking part and a French-speaking part, and you look at the separatist movement from the English-speaking parts to form an independent Anglophone country, what they call the Ambazonia. And that has been going on for quite a while now, when they have just taken up arms against the majority Francophone government troops. And it's possible to just trace it back to the First World War and then the aftermath of the First World War in Cameroon. For Nigeria, I think it is somewhat different because, like I argued, the idea of modern Nigerian nationalism could be traced to the First World War, because for the first time, soldiers from different parts of the country with different identities, different ethnic background, a different religion, we fought together as a single unit in a war, as not the northern protectorates, not the troops from the southern part, just Nigerian regiment, all of them. And this was the first time. Of course, it's easier to argue that, Nigerian nationalism became a thing after the Second World War, but we cannot just dismiss the influence of the campaign in Cameroon. Another interesting thing is the modern concept of the Nigerian military as a national institution. I think that came from that period. Last thing I'd like to add is the idea of looking at the war as a sideshow. I think in so many ways, to look at the war, the First World War in Africa, especially the campaign in Cameroon as a sideshow, is an insult to thousands of African troops, carriers, and those who were involved, basically, acted in one capacity or the other. Even those who, produce some of the resources that was used during this period, this was not a sideshow for them. And like some scholars have argued, the same importance we give to the campaigns in Europe, we should look at it the same way. Like, war is war, and the war in Africa has the same importance to a lot of people who fought in the war, and even to the countries of Africa today.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today and sharing your expertise.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for listening. If you have questions, suggestions, or comments, we want to hear from you. You can find us on Twitter at MacArthur1880, on Facebook as the General Douglas MacArthur Memorial, or you can email MacArthurMemorial@norfolk.gov.